Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the AIM Growth Partners podcast. Today I'm thrilled to be joined by Stefan, the CEO and founder of Artifact Security. And today we're going to be diving into unpacking what Stefan and his business Artifact Security are specifically doing, which is revolutionizing creating a gold standard in the cybersecurity space. Stefan, welcome to the show.
Hi, David. Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. And Stefan, for the listeners who don't know who you are already, could we begin with a bit of an introduction? Who you are and who is Artifact Security?
Sure. So I am Stefan. I've been in cybersecurity testing for about 14 years now. I started off as an analyst, digging down and searching for malware, what it does, how other security products deal with it. I was a very early employee at SC Labs, which is one of the biggest testing company in my industry, where I ended up being a technical lead and a CTO. And I founded Artifact Security about 2 months ago now. We started, where we are still trying to establish ourselves. Obviously, it's a very competitive side of things here, and a lot of people don't really know what cybersecurity testing is and what it should be used for and so on. But yeah, I have a CTO turn into a CEO sort of journey, where I've tried to develop my skills in that sort of aspect.
Well, I guess a good place to start then. You mentioned a lot of people don't understand security testing and why it's so important. So let's unpack that first of all, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. So this is something that I really want to sort of provide more education for in the industry, because a lot of people have different views of what testing is for. A lot of people see it just as a marketing tool for security vendors to pay for a nice badge. They use it in their sales marketing and then they move on. Sadly, sometimes it's used just for those purposes. However, good testing should be done using factual exploits and not, I don't think the industry is in a place anymore where there's people making up results or anything like that. It's just about having the appropriate methodologies for the technology that you're testing, understanding the customer needs. And I'm talking that from the perspective of business. Why would I want this security product? As testers, we need to understand what their needs are. So when we design methodologies and evaluations, we need to consider those needs, and make our methodology as realistic as possible. It's getting more and more tricky, especially with AI and so on. You have to constantly evolve and so on. But if we go back to the question of what security testing is, it can serve validation of new technology. So if you have a new approach, we can offer you validation of, hey, this is actually something that can in real world.
There's the competitive intelligence side of things where, hey, how do we stack up against all the competitors in the market? So we get to see that side. And the best engagements are always the engineering engagements where, hey, we have this feature, we don't quite know how good it is, or we want to know how good we are at dealing with, APT, running a real Fed group. And that's when we sit down with them. They're quite heavy engagements where, hey, let's really test this and see how the attack actually happened in the real world. And then we sort of offer permutations on that and how they can evolve in the future, and sort of guide them into maybe you should consider having different approach to dealing with these threats and actually testing how good their engines are. Those are always the best projects, because the line we always used was, if you treat us as an engagement, as an engineering engagement with the marketing benefits, then hopefully everybody wins. So you get the engineering win of, hey, this is how good your product is and this is what you can do to improve. And then there's also a marketing benefit at the end where you can shout about your results of how good we are and so on. The industry sort of goes in waves of where the budget comes from and so on. But I won't go too deep for it right now.
Well, I think it's interesting probably having to stay agile enough and position yourself that you can kind of feed the egos or the appetites of those different kind of budget holders. That of course you will have people that it will just be a marketing employee. And as a non-technical person myself, I can obviously at a high level sort of understand the rationale behind wanting to get tested. And I think more than anything, having that gold standard where the cybersecurity market is such a competitive market that, just saying all these wild claims that go about there. I think it can definitely see the need for this testing, this rigorous testing, so that these claims are based on rigorous testing and methodologies rather than kind of anecdotal evidence. So it seems like that's, from a marketing perspective, a real kind of having that rubber stamp or that gold stamp of this is a trusted, well-tested, vetted, third-party tested solution.
There's having those sort of discussions with stakeholders that may not understand why you would want to be part of the test is quite tough. From the security vendor side, they sometimes come to us and say, we've been told by either a bank or something like that we need a test. They don't even know what it is and how they go about doing it, and so or how to process our logs or our results or anything like that. They just know that they need a badge, so you have to sort of guide them through the journey and explain to them what it actually means and so on. From the other side of things, when you're a new startup in cybersecurity, third-party validation is usually a good way to sort of get your, like you're saying, that the stamp that, hey, we're actually legit and we are a product that does what we say we do and so on. And that usually goes through certification testing. We like to sort of classify our testing in 3 different stages, where you have certification, where you prove that what you say you do actually happens. And the biggest analogy, and I'm going to have to give a shout out to my previous employer for that, is it's sort of like, if you're testing a kitchen, we're not testing how good the kitchen food actually is. We're just testing that it actually works and it's healthy. You're not going to get poisoned from going there, but we're not saying it's better or worse than another kitchen. And that's the sort of certification that you can sort of engage with when you're on an early startup. That's probably what you need. Then once you become a bit more mature, you start thinking about what we're calling evaluations, where we look at real life threats and trends and apply that in a new test specific for whatever product you have. If it's an EDR product, XDR, email security, cloud, whatever it is. And then that's sort of the next step of that from our side is something we call comprehensive product evaluations, where these are very sort of the heavy engagements I was mentioning earlier, where we literally sit on a daily call with their product engineers and so on, and we say, okay, we've done this, let's look at it again. You guys missed this specific techniques or something like that. And those are really, really intense engagements from both our side and the client side, because it's not, it's not just a cost of, hey, we're paying for your services. It's the human cost behind it, where they need to have those engineers that maybe they had planned to do something else in the client area or something like that, and they have to spend a week with us telling them why they're not as good. And it's hard sometimes to not. You have to make sure that people don't take it personally. We're not here to insult people or anything like that. But from a founder's perspective, I totally understand. You build something, and then if somebody tells you this is not quite good, then you might take that as a personal attack. But it's we have to, as long as we have the logs and the proof for that, we just have to be harsh sometimes.
How do you go about it? It's interesting, given how difficult it sounds to sell this sort of service to businesses. How do you go about getting your clients then? Because it does sound like you mentioned previously, sometimes banks might say you need this sort of level of cert. So talk to me, how do you generally acquire clients?
Yeah, sure. So probably I should have said from the start is our initial focus at least is on the enterprise market. We're slowly building into the SMB sort of sector, but in terms of building clients in that market, it is building trust and sort of word of mouth, where we have market analysts like Forrester or Gartner, where they sort of nudged people. I'm going to use the word nudge of like, hey, you should probably do some comparative testing and some testing to sort of get to be better in these like magic quadrants or whatever waves reports you produce and so on, because they speak about the sort of sales and they use a bit of the product, but those people don't actually do the factual testing. They rely on third-party results to do that. Now, it depends on the company. Sometimes if they've all been tested before, so say you're in the process of buying £1 million worth of license of product X, you want to listen to the sales team of that product, but probably not too closely. If you're big enough, you may have your own team that can do that sort of testing in-house, but it is very expensive, both from a human perspective and from technology perspective, to basically create an analog of whatever your production environment is, just to play around with. So if you're not prepared for it, you may not do it just for one-off things. It's better to come to somebody who's done it before, and it's much more efficient at doing it. Those sort of engagements can be quite educational from both sides, because we all can also sort of fit the approach of, hey, they tell us about specifically what they use. So let's say, they have some really good products when it comes to email security, and we do a test where a lot of the threats there are delivered through email, and our goal is to test something on the endpoint. If it naturally would reach the endpoint through email, we would still have to launch that attack through an email to get to an endpoint. But then we can do the testing and we can assess the endpoint solution. But then we'll sit down with them and say, like, hey, if you had, depending on what email site product you have, probably may not worry about these threats that this endpoint product has missed, and so on. Or there's always a discussion about, for example, false positives and alert fatigue, which is really quite trending right now, where we have so many products where SOC analysts nowadays just get flooded with tons and tons of alerts, and they don't know how to triage all of them and so on. And we've done this research a couple of months ago where we really wanted to get the right answer of which product's best. Would you want one that just flags up everything, but it also may alert on things that isn't legitimate? Or would you want some product that, is very proactive, and limits down what you see, but it's less hands-on? And it was about 50-50. The answer is there's no silver bullet, which is a classic sort of thing in cybersecurity, where every business's needs are different. So depending on what metrics you track and what's the purpose that you have for doing security engagement. I'm not talking about testing here. I'm talking about if your company is mature enough of, why am I investing money in a security product? Is it to prevent me being hit by a ransomware? Is it because I know I'm going to be scaling up to thousands of employees and I'm going to be more susceptible, or I'm going to do work in a new area, so that I'm going to be more susceptible, or we need new technology and that we need to invest in? Or is it that I'm big enough now that I have teams that does threat intel and all of that, and maybe I have to operationally cut down a bit and see how I can be more efficient? You can do testing for those reasons to see what kind of product, and if it's worth it to sort of change what you have, because a lot of the times, if you have a product that gives you 98% coverage, how much is that extra 2% worth, right? Are you going to? It's not just the license cost that you have to look at. You have to look at people retraining on what they already used and the workflows that they have and so on. So there's loads of different reasons that people would want to do the testing. So when it comes to sort of convincing them of being part of an engagement, it's sort of finding out, okay, what are the challenges, how we can use that, how we can help them really. It's very common for us to come into a sort of a bake-off, we call, where we have these three products that we're considering. Tell us which one's best. So in those sort of engagements, we sometimes say, okay, those three are good, but have you considered this fourth one? And then we'll sort of do a test with all four of them and see what's best for the specific engagement. What's even more curious about that is sometimes, because we have a working relationship with security vendors, it would be very easy for us to say, hey, this client is looking at you guys. Would you want to recommend things, and so on? And very often we specifically get asked, we don't want any contact with the vendor. And that goes back to the point of, they've dealt with the sales. They've done the sales pitch already. They've seen the sales pitch. They've done that. They want an independent person that has no affiliation to the security vendors and so on. No logs or anything like that are passed on to the security vendor. They're all sent to the private enterprise. And it's funny because from when I first started doing this, I was like, oh well, it would make sense. Hey, we work with the security vendors to make their product better. I could go and ask the engineer who makes that product what's the best configuration that you want to use here and so on. But you have to understand that maybe the slightly different view of things. At the end of the day, it's specific to them that we need to look at. What happens is after we do the engagement, we can use the knowledge we have about how this product could work. And let's say they missed something or something, there's a lot of alert fatigue going on or something like that. We can say, hey, in our experience, we've done some other tests. If you tweak this in a certain way, you may get slightly better coverage or whatever metric you're trying to improve. And it's nice to have that.
So if I've understood that correctly, not only are you verifying and validating the vendors, on behalf of the vendors, but also for the end users, verifying their 98% claims that they put out in their marketing is legitimate, but
Yes.
also you're helping make sense and cut through the noise, as they might be considering 3 vendors all make the same claim of 98% detection and response capability within a certain amount of time. And so you can test and verify whether that's true, but then also offer that impartial advice that actually, from a cost perspective, to go from 96% to 98%, probably not worth it, because the actual consequence of that 2% risk is minimal, really, in terms of the dollar or pound amount. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, and it goes into this. I have a blog coming up later this week, but there's lots of other documents out there about risk appetite, where there's different metrics where each business should look at, of what is your risk appetite. And I think it depends on what industry you're in. Like, if you're on the financial side, you're probably more risk averse. I mean, I'm guessing people in retail nowadays, after recent events, are going to be a bit more intense now when it comes to assessing the security. Yeah, so it's all about risk appetite there.
And I imagine also it depends who you're speaking to in the business. You spoke before about the various stakeholders within the business you're talking about. And if you're speaking to the sort of security org and speaking to CISOs, obviously the goal is, zero risk. We want to minimize and mitigate all risks possible. If you're speaking to a CFO or a CEO, there is going to be a level of risk tolerance there. As you mentioned, finance, maybe less so than other industries, but there's going to be some risk tolerance baked in there. And I guess that's where it's satisfying and selling to all different parties, but understanding they're going to have a very different risk appetite as well.
Yeah, and it's sort of, I always think of ourselves as, walking a really tight, infinitely small rope, because we have to balance everybody else's views. And, we're going to have our own biases. We're humans. I can't sit here and pretend that we don't have our own biases, but we have to try our best. And as long as we're transparent about the conclusions that we make in any testing, then everybody sort of understands why we're making the decisions we're making. I'm talking about the client engagement specifically here, for example. When it comes to working with so many security vendors, you may think that since you're doing work with the security vendors on this side, you're going to be biased towards the review and not the customer. But if I sit and just stay focused on vendor A, then every other vendor is going to hate me. So I can't be biased towards vendor A. I have to listen to everybody. And then if I just stay biased towards the vendors, then eventually the tests are not going to be useful for them, because if I'm not looking at what the customer needs, the customer won't ask to be in a test. They'll just say, oh, it's a useless badge, who cares? And they'll move on. So there's that element of trust in what we do, and the ethics behind it. It's something that you have to master a lot, because I think it's very easy to, hey, give me some insane amounts of money, I'll get you a badge. It will work for a year, and then after that you'll be gone, and the industry suffers, and it will come through eventually. I'm also a board member of AMT as well, which is the Anti-Malware Testing Standards Organization, and they announced testing standard I think it was about 8 years ago now. And you'd think that the standards tell you what to do in terms of a technical level. Nothing to do with that. It's just about how you operate. when I started in the industry, I was very sad to see the state of it, to be honest. It's so much better now. But what the standard actually does is, let's say I do a comparative, right? I have 5 vendors that are part in a public comparative, and I'm going to publish a report for it. I have to disclose, first of all, how I'm funding that and I have to give every participant the right to dispute results. So I have to be able to go to each of them individually and say, hey, you missed this, and I have to give them the right to say, no, oh, you tested wrong, or you made a mistake here, or so on. So yeah, it's what I think it's common sense. When you look back 12 years ago, most of the major testers were doing it, but there were a few rogue testers that would, there's another aspect of transfer. If I say I'm going to test you by using APT29, I'm going to test using APT29, not some other, campaign and so on. And there's arguments there where you'll say you're giving an unfair advantage to the vendor that they wouldn't have in the real world. My argument against that is when you go to an exam, you sort of know the curriculum, but you don't know the actual questions that come up. So you know the techniques, for example, but how you implement a technique is very different. And that's why multiple testers exist, and my testing isn't going to be perfect. There's other testers out there, and the best sort of way to evaluate your purchasing decision is if you see a product that does well in multiple tests, you can probably assume it's a good product.
Good product.
There's different ways to test the same thing. So if it's undergone so much scrutiny, it's probably on the right track. Another thing I could be looking for is actually performance over time. It's something, what I mean here about is long-term performance. So it's always nice to see product maturity. Let's look at Microsoft. If we look at Microsoft about 14 years ago, they didn't really care about Windows Defender. For Windows 7, it was an absolute crap fest and so on. You could maybe do things about it and so on, but they started caring more and more about security of their ecosystem, and they invested more and more into that sort of things. And I remember testing them back then when we had charts that would go like in negative, so we had to go down on the y-axis just because of how bad they were. But with seriousness in terms of the programs that they've made to make the ecosystem better, and we're just working with engineering teams. I think if you see a product that is either always stable at the top or consistently improving, see that the team actually has the right operations behind them. To be honest, we've dealt with companies where we found out later, but we would test with them for a couple of quarters, and then you would bump into that company, years down the line, and we would ask, hey, why didn't you guys do better or something like that? And you find out that the results never got to the right person, and they would just disappear in the ether, right? So when you see a vendor that is constantly improving or is always at the top, that means they have their engineering departments going. They're processing the right results, right threads. They're always keeping up to date with threads. And again, you can't always one-to-one predict that you can be at the top, but it's the more likely bet that they're going to be high performers than staking yourself onto a new company.
That makes sense. And a question that's been burning, I've been wondering how to kind of phrase it best. So you took your previous company, which is a leader within the security testing, you worked up to CTO there. You mentioned how difficult it can be selling your services to companies. So I guess the burning question is, what was it that made you decide to go and set up your own business in a market that was already, relatively saturated? It's a hard sell. What was it that kind of motivated you, and what sort of gap did you see, or what was broken with the testing process?
Sure. So I think I've sort of spoken praises to the whole industry in the last sort of 5 minutes of me ranting. I hope it wasn't 5 minutes. But I think we have now gotten a bit stale when it comes to how agile some companies are within the space. Where, hey, we've done things a certain way, we're gonna just keep doing the same way because it works. I think I hate to sort of use the AI term, but it does change a lot of things, both on there's just so many facets of in terms of development, in terms of the human element of security. I think that's a whole different series of podcasts that we can do. I can't go on about it here. But my main purpose here was to try to shift into new approaches to technology and always be there to give them methodologies and proof of value, proof of concept as fast as possible. Because the whole point here is, hey, there's new approaches to penetrate the network and to get into a company. People are coming up with new ideas and new products all the time. The products themselves sometimes are not secure, so we need to be faster and adapt a lot better than what we've been doing. I've sort of felt disappointed about how the industry is going currently. As, I am a board member of AMD, so like I said, the standards that I spoke about, that was, as I said, about 8 years ago. I think it's time for new change, and so the standards will always be slow because everybody in the industry has to adopt them. Building a standard, I was there in the meetings and so on, and it's difficult. But as a company, I can be a lot more agile and move into what direction I want to. Specifically, the SMB market itself right now, I think I'm just gonna say it's a mess, where they get treated as second-class citizens, to be honest, where they get leftovers from the enterprise markets, or they have to deal with sort of consumer level things. So that's something that we're currently exploring and to try to help, because the discussion is very tough to have there, where from client education is even worse than when it comes to enterprises. Enterprises are a lot more security aware, and they know why they should invest into security and so on. Not just talking about security testing, I'm talking about security overall here. But when it comes to SMBs, depending on the size and the vertical there, and it's just a lot of education needs to happen. Again, for them, regulation sometimes is the biggest factor that pushes them into taking security seriously. I think whenever there's big breaches like we just had, that lights up a bit more as well. But we understand that you just don't have the resources when you're smaller. You just don't have the resources. But more and more, there's the supply chain attacks where the best way to get into a bigger business is to try to penetrate a smaller one, and that's you abuse that trust in relationship. So they're actually more susceptible to attacks than they think of. I hate the scare tactic of it's no matter of if when, but I really do think that is the case, especially with how easy it is now to launch attacks and so on. So yeah, the two main things is moving and fast and adopting new technologies as fast as possible in terms of proving their value and how they are in the market. And the secondary for us was this SMB market and trying to sort of help people know what they want. They have to go through MSPs and so on. But there's a lot more to be done there.
It's interesting. I've had, obviously yourself included, a lot of fantastic guests on the podcast, and a lot of people have walked away from the bigger kind of organizations because they're wanting to tackle this SMB problem. And I think it's interesting when you talked about the recent, attacks on the retail side of things. Presumably further forward, these larger enterprises are going to be thinking more carefully about the security of the SMBs and the companies they work with that are part of their supply chain, because this is obviously, it's not a new thing, but it's exposed how vulnerable these supply chains are. So I guess extrapolating from that, the businesses like my previous guest, like yourself, that are focusing on solving this SMB problem, are going to capitalize, because it's not just going to be an SMB problem. Enterprises are going to be putting downward pressure on these SMBs to fire and improve their security. So it seems like there's a massive opportunity that these big SaaS businesses that just want to go after the whales, the large enterprises, are completely neglecting, but will miss out loads.
Yeah, exactly. And it's, to be honest, it's something that I was at a conference last month, I think, and I was meeting with a few CISOs from one of the biggest companies in the UK, and we were talking about supply chain attacks because it was a theme in the conference and so on. And we kept trying to push the thing of, hey, it's you guys also that needs to push these companies to get better. And I think it's a bit biased because I was at a security conference, so the people there were already more security minded, right? So those people were already are pushing their partners to be more secure and so on. But it's the people who aren't at this conference that we need to tackle and sort of educate of why it's important. And I do hope, again, I hate to repeat myself, but I think regulation, but it's also how we implement it. It's such a tricky thing where sometimes regulation gets treated as a tick box ticking exercise. And hey, I have a firewall. Is it plugged in? Is it configured? Does it actually inspect things? You know, you have cyber essentials and so on. They don't how good are the auditors around that and so on. It's it's a tough challenge there when it comes to convincing them to, hey, it's not just ticking a box. You need to actually take this seriously because I think it was with you where I was thinking about if you're SMB and you have one big client, losing the trust of that client because of a security breach is probably a lot more serious than a bigger company who has multiple clients that they can depend on. But you have to realize that risk appetite that we spoke about. But again, in the SME market, are you even tracking that metric and so on? Do you have the resources to do that? Completely understand it. From a human perspective, I understand it. As a security practitioner and so on, there's so many different things that can scare you and think about, but then you go down we won't get any work done if we just think about security all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's it. Yeah, it's so interesting. Back to what we were saying, like speaking to the security team or going to those conferences which are with security people, they're naturally going to be much more mindful, much more aware of this. When you speak to, CEOs, CFOs, or different departments within larger organizations, it's a hindrance. It's something that gets in the way, and the mindset's very different. And I guess on that sort of slightly related, what I'm interested in understanding, you explained why, you set up artifact security. You're saying you needed a bit more, there was a need for a much more agile approach to security testing. What are the kind of the biggest surprises or challenges you've noticed since stepping from, top of technology game CTO into the CEO seat? What's been the main kind of like challenges or surprises you've noticed?
Stop talking about technology. Stop talking about technology, really. The biggest challenge from my side was trying to focus too much on the why this is better than what's currently going on or things like that, and not looking at the specific reasons of why they need somebody or some service. Brand recognition is obviously always one. I have my own name within the industry and I can speak to the right people, but convincing other stakeholders within a company that they need it, it's about trying to convert the technical language into something that they care about. You're not going to go on about which APT to be honest to a finance guy. They don't care. They care about how many licenses and how much it's going to cost them and so on. So that's sort of probably the biggest challenge is having that discussion away from why this is a better test or so on, into why you need this and why we can address and help you, but specifically to the metrics that you care about. And I keep repeating myself around metrics is because I think it's something that I really want to drive home about is having the right metrics that we can empower businesses to make the right decisions. It's something that was not focused before, but it really has been a focus for us in the last couple of months as Artifact. We can't sit on our high horse and say, we know what's best for you from the outside. What we can do is give you enough information. And yes, if you ask for us to tailor it to your business, then sure, we can have that discussion. But let's empower you to give you the information, factual information, not just sales and marketing that you need to make the right decision.
Yes, that's one of the big challenges as well when you've kind of sought out this. I know security testing isn't something new, but going at it in quite an agile way, it's easy to risk being compared with, some of the other security testing who aren't as agile, who aren't, as don't maybe have as good methodologies or maybe aren't as modern as you are with your the methodologies you're using. Being able to kind of position yourself in a way that's not being kind of price compared or being compared with these other kind of people with more case studies. It's selling the results or selling and solving a pain point rather than selling yourself on we're X amount better or X amount more accurate or this much faster, that much cheaper. It's a case of we can solve this problem this much easier or whatever else.
That's exactly like one of the biggest organizations in this space is MITRE, and everybody in this, well, most people in the security industry would know what MITRE attack, and they also do evaluations every year on different sectors of the market and so on. And it's it's very easy to say, hey, you know, those evaluations, we do them, but faster, better, stronger, you know, and so on. But that's not how you're gonna go. That's not how you win a pitch, because, you know, why wouldn't they just go to Mitre? They have a bigger brand recognition and so on. But the discussion needs to be specific to their pain point and so on. And, you know, depending on the customer, maybe they were part of that evaluation and maybe they weren't happy with it. Let's talk about those things rather than with them but cheaper, or with them but faster, or with them but better. It's better to just be specific to, from the security vendor side, is okay, what do you actually need, and where's your product going? Or from the business side and the client side is like, okay, what metrics are useful for you guys, so I understand what to give to the public, or in a private engagement, what to give you guys as all your stakeholders that you actually need to get engagement out of. So, you know, the report that we sent to a CEO is completely different than what the project manager gets, and so on. Let's tackle those issues rather than comparing ourselves to what's already there.
That's definitely something I've been guilty of, and I'm sure I've lost a lot of business and probably sent a load of business to other people who weren't expecting it by,
Yeah.
a bit like this, but not this. I'm like that, but cheaper, or, and then the problem is then you're just hoping that cost is the number one thing they're going for, and you're a bit sort of stabbing in the dark. So actually, instead, it seems much more effective in saying, this is what I do. And, you're like this, you're like that. No, what I do is this. Because as soon as you do then start comparing yourselves with other things, it could be Mitre's, you're saying you're better, but Mitre's more established. We'll go with Mitre because it's that trusted brand, and that brand recognition is such a strong, such a powerful a thing that people use decision making thing, isn't it? And what's the goal with the business then? So you stepped away from CTO role, you set up Artifact Security, you've got a novel agile approach to security testing. You want to stay kind of away from, we're like Forrester and Gartner, we're like this, we're like that, but better. So what is the goal with the business then? What I guess kind of would success look like for you over the next few years?
Over the next few years, well, first of all, in the SMB market, we hope to, I'm going to be very cocky here and say almost revolutionize how people think about buying a security product, and sort of be the one-stop shop of, hey, I have a new security approach. Let's go to Artifact to first of all validate it, and then let's see how it does in the real world, and then let's see how it does versus potential competitors. Those are the two sort of main things. If you ask me in sort of 5 years time and so on, I know there's a lot of brand awareness that needs to be done and so on, but what we're aiming to do that is, first of all, just by security education overall, and providing resources to people to understand of why they should care about testing to start with. I think especially in the SME market, they just are flooded with information, and I know it looks like I'm going to flood them with more information, but we hope to provide them with actual factually test cases, not, hey, this is a quote unquote fact sheet from a vendor that said that this box will do 100 gigabytes of performance and so on, and give you the best AI security of whatever. Let's look at the actual data rather than just what's on the website.
I guess trust is such an important thing in sales generally, but cybersecurity specifically. So once you get those sort of vendors, partners that you've kind of worked with and tested, that's going to be incredible sort of win and validation. I said not trying to compare you with Forrester and Gartner and stuff out there, but once you are kind of synonymous with the security gold standard, for those sort of products, that organic growth will expedite, I imagine.
Yes, I think to drive a sort of a comparison here, where if I could be a sort of a gardener for an SMB, then I think that would be great. I think that's, if people will view us as that in a few years' time, that would be a great success for us. For the enterprise market and so on, we are an important sort of part of that chain of information when it comes to how those market analysts work, and how security vendors and the relationship between them and their clients work. And we already are part of that chain. It's about that sort of brand recognition. But I think on the SMB market, it's very tough to do business there. But I think it's sort of untapped market when it comes to security testing specifically, because nobody looks at it because it is so complicated. So I think we need to simplify the whole process.
So revolutionizing security testing for the SMB, the underserved portion of the market. Then
yeah. Oh wow, is that going to be is that the one title for the podcast? Yeah,
I was going to say that's a good sort of soundbite to end on, isn't it? I was like, that's.
Yeah, I might take that actually from now on. By the way.
Well, please do. I'm quite proud of that when I came up with that one. Fantastic. Well, look, it's been absolute pleasure learning, a bit more about the business, your transition from CTO to CEO. Really interesting understanding how you're standing out in this quite crowded market, difficult market, fickle market, I should say, and you're really kind of democratizing. Seems like something I said on the podcast quite often with some of these people about on democratizing cybersecurity solutions, SMB. But it's nice to see you're kind of joining the fight from the security testing angle. I think some of the previous guests I've had will probably be very good people for me to introduce you to. And, I look forward to kind of seeing how the business evolves over the next few years and seeing every success.
Yeah, thank you, David, and thank you for having me here. It's been a very interesting discussion, and I'm happy to be back again. Maybe we can discuss some other topics. More than happy. Thank you.
I love that. Thank you very much, Stefan.
Thank you.